The fence that would eventually ignite one of the most dramatic HOA battles the neighborhood had ever witnessed began as nothing more than a practical home improvement. For years, the property line behind Ethan's house had been marked by an aging wooden fence, one that leaned like a tired old man, sagging in the middle and eaten through at the bottom by years of moisture and neglect. Every storm carved a little more life out of it, and every gust of wind left it rattling like a warning. The wood was soft, splitting in places, and so discolored that the grain was hardly visible anymore. Ethan, who had been steadily saving to renovate different parts of his modest home, finally decided the fence had reached the end of its lifespan. He wanted something sturdy, consistent, durable, something that wouldn't need replacing again anytime soon. So he researched, compared materials, and eventually selected a composite fencing option. It wasn't flashy or bold. The color blended naturally with the home's neutral tones. The height was standard for privacy. Everything about it was calm, predictable, and within the guidelines of what most neighborhoods considered perfectly acceptable. The installation crew arrived early one quiet morning. They worked with the precision of people who had done the job hundreds of times. Old boards came down methodically, stacked and hauled away, leaving a temporary openness between properties that felt oddly exposed. The crew dug, measured, leveled, and aligned new posts with care. For 2 days, the steady rhythm of drilling and hammering marked the progress of something ordinary and uneventful. At least, it should have been. Then came the moment everything shifted. Then came her. Karen. A name that in this community carried the weight of whispered warnings, shared sighs, and reluctant respect for her sheer ability to inject herself into everyone's business. She was the self-appointed guardian of the HOA's rules, roaming the streets with a clipboard, a phone, and a sense of authority that towered many feet above her actual height. The first time she saw the fence, she stopped walking. She stared at it for a long, uncomfortable moment, and then she pulled out her phone. It wasn't the look of a curious neighbor admiring new construction. It was the calculating, narrowing gaze of someone searching, hunting for something wrong, something she could seize upon. She moved closer to the fence, tracing her eyes along the top edge with the precision of someone inspecting contraband. Her body language was sharp and rigid, as though she were bracing herself against the potential disappointment of not finding a violation. For the next few days, she walked by repeatedly, each time pausing longer, each time using her phone to take pictures from various angles, height, distance, alignment with other fences, shadows, anything she could use as ammunition. Ethan didn't think much of it at first. The neighborhood had a few overly involved residents, and he assumed she was simply curious. But on the morning after the contractors finished the job, an envelope appeared on his doorstep. Not mailed, not professionally delivered, simply dropped there by hand. The letter inside was written with the kind of exaggerated formality that tried too hard to sound official. Every line bristled with superiority. The message was unmistakable. The fence was in violation of height restrictions by approximately 2 inches, and corrective action was required urgently to avoid progressive disciplinary consequences. 2 inches! 2 inches stood between regular life and a full-blown HOA war. And only someone like Karen would think that 2 inches justified a threat. Most homeowners would have shrugged it off or complied reluctantly, hoping to avoid conflict. But something about the letter felt off. The rules she cited seemed obscure, almost artificially specific, buried in a subsection of a subsection. So Ethan read deeper. And the deeper he read, the stranger things became. The fence restrictions she referenced had not been mentioned in any HOA updates for years. No one else's fence seemed to follow her measurements. The rule had dust on it, figuratively and possibly literally, from long-term disuse. He walked around the neighborhood, taking note of the other fences. Some were taller than his, others varied in style or spacing. None seemed to have been measured with the obsessive precision Karen was applying. When he casually mentioned the letter to a neighbor, they laughed with disbelief before growing serious and telling him he wasn't alone. Apparently, many residents had received strange or overly strict notes from Karen over the years, notes that were often contradictory, selectively enforced, or suspiciously personal. Someone had once been reprimanded for leaving a garden hose coiled in a described as an unsightly manner. Another neighbor had been warned for having a decorative item of insufficient aesthetic value by their front door. Yet oddly enough, a friend of Karen's had a yard full of lawn ornaments that no one dared question. Patterns began to emerge, patterns that suggested selective enforcement, patterns that pointed to a personal vendetta rather than a legitimate issue. The more he learned, the more he began to wonder, why did she care about his fence? Why now? The answer began to reveal itself in fragments. One neighbor spoke quietly about structures in Karen's own backyard, structures that didn't match any known HOA guidelines, a shed no one remembered being approved, a patio extension that seemed larger every year, a semi-permanent canopy that she claimed was temporary, even though it had been there beyond any reasonable definition of the word. Another neighbor explained how Karen had a history of making loud threats about reporting violations whenever someone challenged her or upset her indirectly. Someone else mentioned she had once blocked the approval of a neighbor's home addition simply because she claimed they were disrespectful toward her at a meeting. The more stories he collected, the more a picture formed. Karen wasn't protecting the rules, she was protecting her control. The fence, in truth, was never the real issue. It was just the excuse she needed, a tool she could wield, a way to assert dominance in a space where she had long enjoyed unchecked authority. But the strange part, the part no one fully understood, was why she had targeted him of all people. He hadn't argued with her. He barely knew her. He didn't attend HOA meetings. He had no history of disputes. And yet, somehow, he became her next target. He began looking deeper. He read every line of the HOA rulebook, discovering inconsistencies, outdated sections, and vague guidelines that left too much room for interpretation. He examined meeting notes, finding suspicious gaps where certain complaints seemed to vanish. He noticed that rules some residents broke routinely never received warnings. Then he found the key detail that tied it all together. Karen was on the enforcement committee. Not just a volunteer, but the self-appointed head. She processed complaints. She determined which ones were reviewed. She interpreted rules however she pleased. And she had been in that position for years. It became painfully clear. She was the system, and she used that system to shape the neighborhood in her own image. For the first time since the letter arrived, a sense of resolve began forming inside him. The fence wasn't a violation. The real violation was her abuse of authority. He hadn't set out to challenge her, but the moment she pushed him, she had woken something in him, something patient, meticulous, and unwilling to be bullied. He began documenting everything, every rule, every inconsistency, every complaint she had filed, every structure in her yard that appeared to break the same rules she enforced on others. The fence stood tall behind his home, clean, straight, and perfectly lawful, and as he gathered evidence, he realized something important. The fence didn't start a battle. Karen did, and she had no idea who she was dealing with.
The day after receiving the complaint, Ethan sat at his dining table with the HOA rulebook spread out in front of him. What he expected to be a quick search turned into a deep dive into an outdated, contradictory web of regulations. The binder itself looked older than some of the homes in the neighborhood, packed with pages yellowing around the edges and marked with handwritten notes from various past board members. It had been patched together through years of revisions, addendums, corrections, and half-finished amendments. The more he read, the more he felt the weight of what the community had silently endured for years. The rules themselves were not inherently unreasonable. Most were standard guidelines intended to keep the neighborhood uniform and well-maintained. But the language was murky, with entire sections vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on who was reading them. That vagueness was where the real problem lived. In those gray areas, Karen had found her power. He organized his notes carefully, almost methodically, as though piecing together a puzzle. First, he highlighted the sections about fencing. The height restrictions were buried in an old amendment from nearly 15 years prior, referencing measurement standards that had not been enforced in over a decade. The section didn't even match the newer guidelines added 6 years ago. In those updated sections, fences were categorized differently by material, location, and purpose, but none referred to the 2-inch tolerance that Karen had cited in her complaint. Then came the more curious discoveries. In the rulebook's margin next to the fencing guidelines, someone had scribbled notes that looked suspiciously like Karen's handwriting. Short, clipped phrases about strict enforcement necessary and visual harmony. They were not official notes, they were simply thoughts, but they showed clearly that she had been looking for reasons to control fence-related changes long before his project even began. After documenting those inconsistencies, he shifted to another section, the process for filing and reviewing complaints. This was where the real mess began. The rules stated that all complaints had to be logged, time-stamped, reviewed by at least 2 committee members, and filed into public records accessible during community meetings. But when he cross-referenced those guidelines with the actual logs, publicly accessible through the HOA's online portal, he found holes. Not small ones, entire chunks of missing complaints, gaps where entries should have been, dates that appeared without explanations, and strangely enough, certain residents, particularly those known to be friendly with Karen, had unusually clean records despite having visible property features that didn't match requirements. Worse yet, several complaints filed against Karen were missing entirely. One neighbor recalled submitting a complaint about a large shed on her property years earlier. That complaint did not appear in the logs. Another neighbor remembered reporting an oversized pergola that seemed to extend beyond property lines. That, too, was nowhere to be found. It was clear she wasn't just enforcing rules selectively, she was manipulating the filing system itself. As he continued reading, something interesting happened. The rulebook shifted from being a random mess of outdated regulations to being a map, one that revealed how someone could abuse the system if they had the access and arrogance to do so. Karen had both. But what he found next was even more revealing. He dug into the HOA meeting minutes from the past 3 years, tedious to read, poorly organized, and filled with terminology that made them sound more official than they actually were. Beneath the stiff formality of the notes, subtle patterns emerged. Whenever topics related to property modifications arose, Karen's name appeared. She volunteered for inspections. She recommended rule interpretations. She suggested revisions. She even proposed fines, sometimes very steep ones, for what she called persistent non-compliance. What struck Ethan most was how often she inserted herself into decisions. She rarely allowed others to complete sentences. She frequently clarified misunderstandings on behalf of the HOA. And in several meetings, she had pushed through decisions without proper votes, decisions that conveniently allowed her to extend her authority or narrow the rules in ways that benefited her. In the minutes from a meeting 2 years prior, she had even claimed responsibility for upholding aesthetic consistency throughout the neighborhood. That phrase alone revealed her mindset. She wasn't maintaining rules, she was curating the neighborhood like a personal gallery, one where she could decide what fit and what didn't. The more Ethan read, the more he realized something profound. Karen didn't see herself as part of the HOA, she saw herself as the HOA. By the time he finished reading through his stack of documents, the sun had shifted across the room and the day had slipped into late afternoon. Yet, despite the hours spent reviewing the rulebook, he felt far from tired. He felt energized, focused, like he had stepped into a bigger fight than he had expected, one he was increasingly prepared for. With the rules largely mapped out, he turned his attention to her property, guided by the rumors he had heard from neighbors. If she was violating rules herself, those violations might be buried somewhere in public records, and so he went searching. He found aerial imagery from local surveys, publicly available through county resources. In those high-angle shots, he saw something unmistakable. Her yard had changed significantly over time. In one image from 5 years ago, her yard was plain, simple, unmodified, completely typical. But in the next year's image, new square shapes appeared. The following year, a large canopy. Then a structure that cast a long shadow, possibly the shed neighbors mentioned. Then a widened patio area that looked far larger than anything permitted by the guidelines. The changes weren't subtle, they were bold and deliberate, and every one of them would have required a permit she never applied for. He saved the images, marking dates and changes. The evidence was piling up so quickly that it almost overwhelmed him. What had begun as a petty complaint about a fence had exploded into a corruption problem hiding in plain sight. But the most revealing part came when he reached out, quietly, to people who had stepped down from the HOA board over the years. A few ignored him, but one responded privately. The former board member, who had served for 4 years, provided the final puzzle piece. According to their message, Karen controlled meetings by sending out last-minute schedule changes to people she didn't want attending. She adjusted agenda items without approval. She delayed budget reviews, attempted to push through decisions without proper votes, and used her interpretation of rules to silence people who challenged her. Worse yet, she had created an environment where residents feared retaliation. If you questioned her, you became a target. If you embarrassed her, she found something wrong with your property. And if she couldn't find something, she made something up, or dug deep into obscure rules until she uncovered something she could twist. It was astonishing how much she had managed to get away with, simply because no one bothered to look closely. Most residents had busy lives. They trusted the HOA to operate with fairness and transparency, and that trust had given her the perfect cover to create her own mini-kingdom. Ethan leaned back, his notebook filled with dates, screenshots, references, and rulebook annotations. The initial frustration he felt toward the complaint had transformed into something much stronger, a determination to expose the truth. Yet, even with all the evidence he had collected, there was one lingering question. Why had she targeted him specifically? He thought back to the day the contractors arrived. He remembered her passing by. He remembered her looking at the fence when it was still unfinished. And then it clicked. Her backyard was directly behind his, separated only by the new fence. She wasn't objecting to a violation. She was objecting to losing visibility, losing control, losing the ability to peer into his yard or check what he was doing. The fence didn't break a rule, but it created a boundary she couldn't cross. And Karen despised boundaries she didn't create. That realization pushed her into the next phase of his plan, preparing for the HOA meeting, a meeting where she wouldn't be expecting resistance, a meeting where she thought she still held all the power. But that power was slipping, and she didn't even know it yet. The fence stood straight and solid outside, casting a long shadow over the grass as the afternoon light shifted behind it, a shadow that, in many ways, mirrored the shadow that Karen had cast over the neighborhood for years. But the fence wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. What had started as a simple construction project had transformed into a reckoning the community desperately needed. And Chapter 2 closed with one clear truth. Karen had awakened the wrong person, and her rulebook would finally be used against her.
The truth about Karen's backyard didn't appear all at once. It unfolded slowly, like layers of wallpaper peeling back to expose a wall no one realized was crumbling underneath. At first, Ethan thought the issue ended with her strange obsession over his fence. But the more he noticed small details around her property, the more he realized he had only scratched the surface. It started with that crooked piece of lattice leaning awkwardly against her back fence. To most people, it would have looked like an accidental placement, something someone left behind after a quick yard project. But the angle was wrong. The boards overlapped too perfectly, as if they were meant to block a specific line of sight. It didn't look like clutter. It looked like concealment. Curiosity turned into a quiet, simmering suspicion. He didn't step foot on her property. He didn't peek through cracks or invade privacy. Instead,
He observed patterns, the kind of patterns only someone fed up with selective enforcement would look for. From legal vantage points and publicly accessible views, details started forming a larger picture. Aerial images from previous years created a timeline that was impossible to ignore. In one year, her backyard was empty aside from a basic patio. The next year, a long rectangular structure appeared. A year later, something like a canopy extended across nearly half the space. Another year revealed what looked like a widened concrete area. All of it was gradual enough that most people wouldn't question it. But when you laid it out year after year, the truth hit like a slap. She had been expanding her backyard kingdom without a single documented approval. Neighbors' memories sharpened the picture further. People recalled construction noises early on weekend mornings. Others remembered seeing trucks unloading materials. No one remembered seeing any posted permits or requests being discussed at HOA meetings. Everything Karen added had been slipped into existence quietly, hidden behind her reputation as the rule enforcer. That was her strategy. Whenever she needed to hide a new addition, the neighborhood coincidentally experienced a wave of random enforcement. Someone received a letter about weeds, another was fined for a lawn ornament, a third received a surprise inspection. All smokescreens, all misdirection. She had turned the rulebook into a stage play where she was the star, reciting rules not for fairness, but for control. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. The very fence she accused him of violating was the one structure that actually blocked her from staring into his yard. It threatened her supervision routine. It broke the visual line she used to keep tabs on everyone. It gave him privacy she didn't think he deserved. That was the real issue, not the materials, not the height, not the alignment. Her problem had never been the fence. Her problem had been losing visibility. As Ethan filled a thick binder with evidence, photos, dates, notes, satellite captures, neighbors' testimonies, rulebook inconsistencies, he felt the shift inside himself. He was no longer responding to a petty complaint. He was uncovering a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. With each page he added, the feeling grew stronger. This wasn't about revenge. This was about fairness. The meeting was approaching, and he finally had the truth.
On the evening of the HOA meeting, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The clubhouse lights glowed through the windows, casting long rectangles across the walkway, a path many residents hadn't bothered to walk in months, if not years. But tonight, people gathered. They weren't here for small talk or budget updates. They were here because for once, someone had challenged the authority they had been quietly resenting for far too long. Karen arrived early, wearing the confidence she had worn for years. She sat tall at the head of the table, her binder pressed tightly against her torso like a uniform. This was her domain, her territory, her stage. But the room didn't look like her audience anymore. Ethan felt dozens of eyes flick toward him as he took his seat. People nodded subtly, not in encouragement, but in acknowledgement. Many of them had lived through similar experiences, letters slipped into mailboxes, fines delivered without explanation, rules rewritten mid-year, complaints dismissed without reason, but few had ever collected proof. Tonight was different. When the time came for new business, Ethan rose with his binder. The weight of it was symbolic, a literal stack of truth that contradicted years of unchecked authority. He spoke calmly, pacing the facts in a steady, controlled rhythm. Each violation he revealed wasn't an attack, it was a documented finding, backed by records and neutral observation. He laid out the inconsistencies in the rulebook, the missing amendments, the contradictions between her enforcement and actual HOA policy. And then he walked the board through the timeline of her backyard expansions, year by year, photo by photo, structure by structure. He showed the aerial imagery. He presented the dates. He explained how her projects seemingly appeared during bursts of unrelated crackdowns. His evidence was factual, not emotional, and that made it impossible to ignore. Karen's expression tightened with every page flipped. For the first time in years, she looked unprepared. She reached for her binder, searching for rules to counter him with, but the board members were no longer looking to her for guidance. They were looking at the evidence in front of them. As if on cue, neighbors began standing up. One after another, they shared their own experiences. Years of frustration quietly endured. Each story added weight. Each testimony chipped away at the foundation of control she had built. The board took notes, real notes, not the kind they used to take just to appear official. For the first time, they listened with genuine concern. By the time the meeting adjourned, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Karen gathered her belongings quickly, avoiding eye contact as she stepped out of the room. Her departure lacked its usual authority. The confident stride she once carried had been replaced by something smaller, more fragile. The community had spoken, and she couldn't silence.
The days that followed were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen in years. The board, free of Karen's influence, moved swiftly. A special investigative committee was formed, and not one member was someone she could manipulate. For the first time, the rules she had wielded so aggressively began working against her. They inspected her backyard with objective precision. Measurements were taken. Photographs captured every angle. They compared everything against the official HOA guidelines, the real ones, not the selectively interpreted ones she relied on. What they found was overwhelming. The shed exceeded size limits. The patio extension violated setback requirements. The canopy height was far above the maximum. Decorative features broke color and style rules she herself had enforced. Electrical wiring had been added without safety review, and multiple modifications were made without any recorded approval. Not one or two, but a list long enough to fill multiple pages. Fines were issued. Not symbolic fines, serious ones. Then came the board vote regarding her position. The board members reviewed the evidence. They reviewed the testimonies. They evaluated her years